Okay, I guess I've been introduced so many times I don't need to be introduced again. I'm Liza. Um, but I do have an introduction slide, and I have more slides than I'm going to be able to do in the time allotted, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. I could give a talk on each slide of 20 or 30 minutes, so mostly I put the effort into making the slides so that you would have something to refer to and a stimulus to ask more questions. My mother used to say that fools' names and fools' faces are always seen in public places. And I took this to mean that I should not carve my name in the bark of trees, and I should stay out of the public eye in general. So there's a change. In my retirement, I'm becoming less retiring. I'm both honored and humbled to be here today as a guest and a sort of object of study in an oral history workshop, and also in the company of Lee and Howard and these esteemed scholars that we have here. This is an international community, and since I've been here in Lüneburg, I'm also painfully aware of how American my perspective is. So I hope that everyone will forgive me for being American as I am. I think the future is going to be very international, and I hope that my remarks have some use and scope beyond the sea to shining sea. I'm going to, as Jerry and I talked about putting this workshop together, Jerry said he thought it would be interesting if I talked about my experience in writing computer manuals. So I want you to know that I see the task of writing computer manuals as an act of teaching. Paul is sure I'm going to run out of voice, so now I have water. But I see it as teaching a group of students you know nothing about, you can't see, you can't hear, you can't control. So I'll talk about that as I use the example of writing the original Atari computer manuals in 1978 and 79. Because I know I'm going to run out of time, I want to start sort of at the end and mention some of the influencers who I knew about before I got the job at Atari and who really inspired me to go into this field and to stay in it, and I've now been in it for 50 years. I start with George Leonard, whom you may or may not have heard of, who wrote a book called Education in Ecstasy. And I won't talk about it, but there's a link on this slide for you to find out more about George and his work. He died in 2010. But his vision of how we could use computers as the basis for revolutionizing education was instrumental in getting me excited here. The next person who turned me on was Dean Brown, who we've talked about, or Jerry talked about already. And there are two references to Dean here. I met Dean when I was taking a course in Montessori education, and I spent 5 minutes listening to him begin to lecture about teaching 5-, 6-, and 7-year-olds to program their Montessori lessons so that the other Montessori kids could play them as games, and said, that's my career, that's where I'm going. So Dean is a great inspiration. We've also talked about Bob Albrecht, People's Computer Company. I looked for pictures of these people, and there are no pictures of Bob anywhere. He's funny in that it's hard to reach him. He is still with us. He's, I think, 88 at this point, and the last time I saw him was 3 years ago at the Homebrew Computer Club reunion. And a lot of what he had to say to me was, I'm 85 years old and I'm still here. Isn't this amazing? So we did invite him to be a guest at this, and we didn't hear back from him. I hope he's okay. Don't know. Seymour Papert, who founded the MIT Media Lab, and it was the Artificial Intelligence Lab then, and was one of the inventors of Logo, is another. I don't know how old Seymour is. He's approaching 90. And Seymour had an unfortunate accident where he had brain trauma, about 15 years ago. And he's still alive, but he's not practicing anymore. But I owe at least half my career to him as well. And I'm trying to make sure that the world doesn't forget him. Someone the world never really knew is Stuart Cooney. Stuart was the head of the Instructional Television Consortium for the California State Colleges when I met him in 1975. And he was a tremendously influential mentor for me. He has also passed away. He was the first of this group to die. Dean Brown is also not with us anymore. So we're a dying breed. But I don't want to see the memories go away. So I urge you to look up these folks, and we'll have a seminar on each of them one of these days. The title of my talk has these words in it, and there are reasons for every one. Distance. Distance is in terms of physical separation, space, time, interest, emotion. And the more we mediate our teaching and learning, the more important distance becomes. The other dimension is time, and I call that synchronicity, a nice 50-cent word for this academic meeting. We have the timing of the presentation. We're recording this presentation. It will be seen over and over again at different times. We can't anymore manage the timing of when someone gets your message, how they take it up, what they do with it. And it has very important implications as to how we design our learning tools. Control. The organization that Jerry is involved with has control in its title, and there are many, many different ways that we exercise control in education and learning. And I think the most important thing is something that Lee said, which had to do with play, and the fact that learning, a huge amount of learning takes place when we're playing, when we're not in the control of a teacher. And as more and more learners turn to computer-based mediated sources of learning, the teacher has less and less and less control over the learners, the context that they are learning in, and even what order they encounter the material that we want to teach. So control is a whole nother issue. Exploring is unstructured discovery learning in many ways. And I didn't put play on here, but I should have. And most of what I do is exploring, and I encourage other people to do that. Designing is something that there's an awful lot of hot air given to, and I'm appalled at how bad our design craft is at this point. So that is the basis on which I get to talk about the design elements that I put into the manuals I wrote. And I hope that that serves as an object lesson for the future, because the more we have long distance, asynchronous, and uncontrolled learning, the more important the design of the message is. Teaching is not in my title. Teaching is one of my negative words. I'm much more interested in learning than teaching. And partly because in the current discourse, when we talk about learning, we often only talk about that which is being taught. And we skip all the learning that goes on outside of teaching. So I generally don't want to talk about teaching as much as about learning to sort of counteract that trend. But I will acknowledge that it's very important. It does go on. And it's what I'm doing when I write a manual. Design. I said design is really important. And I said Stu Cooney was one of my key mentors. I took a course called Message Design from Stu, and this slide speaks for itself. Stu is one of our unsung ed tech pioneers. He was revolutionary in his thinking, and we'll come back to him, but I put the slide in so that we would give him due accolades. The form of a message has one purpose: to communicate. And Lee mentioned communication. Howard will mention communication. Really, it's not about computing per se. The computer is test bed, the instrument of communication, not the important issue at all in my, and that's why I'm, in answer to Lily's question, that's why I call myself a people person and not a technical person. There's a lot of technique in computing that doesn't have to do with electronics, or it does have to do with a lot of programming, which is much bigger than electronics and computer programming as well. So I'm going to move on to the manuals and the relationship of design to these three specific computer manuals. Did I miss a slide? No, I just moved it to a different place. So one question is, why did we provide printed computer manuals? And certainly it was a job, but you have to understand that in 1978, we were looking at a brand new product. People didn't know what they were, what the stuff was for and why. There was no connectivity. Most of those early computers you couldn't get online. You had to buy an extra little thing called an acoustic coupler in order to get it onto a telephone, and you had to get a conditioned phone line. You couldn't just use your regular phone line. You had to buy another phone line to get online. So it was a different context. These computers had so little storage that you couldn't store a manual on them. And of course, my client, which was Atari Computers, expected to have to provide a manual. So that's why there was a printed manual. We had lots of discussions about what should go into this manual, and you'll see when I show you the cover that we called it an operator's manual, and it subsequently, the thing that replaced it became an owner's manual, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two. I was told that they wanted a section on unpacking because the computer was packed in a very complicated box with styrofoam conforming packaging, and not everybody knew how to unpack them at that time. Today we're not stopped by that styrofoam, we just tear it up. But then how to open the box was important. How to assemble the machine, the initial operation of it, the ongoing use, its maintenance, contact information for how to get help with it, and advertising. And I'll talk a little bit about my fight with the company about putting advertising in the operator's manual. Let's see. For me, the most important thing on this is who was the audience? Who was I writing this manual for? And I was not writing it for the geeks who never read manuals anyway. Although most of the Ataris probably got sold to them, that was not the target audience. This was a machine that was going to be sold in the sporting goods department of Sears Roebuck. It was not going to be in a computer store. Of course, there weren't any. And so the person that was going to have to use this manual, I couldn't find exactly the right picture, but this lady is good enough. I was imagining that this booklet, which was packed with the computer, would not be used by the people that actually first put the computer together. I was imagining that this machine was purchased by a couple who had a son who was graduating from high school, and this was his graduation present. And he and his father, after graduation, opened up the box and put it together and stuck in a game cartridge and played a bunch of games and maybe wrote a program or two. They never used the manual, and then they went off and did something else. And the next day, this lady finishes with her housework, starts to have her coffee break, and notices the computer on the coffee table. And she knows it works, but she's very hesitant about using it. So she picks up the manual. She's not highly educated. She's not technical. And so that's the audience I was trying to communicate with. And I'll talk a little bit more about why. I'm not merely being sexist in this. It's that I had a real desire to bring computing to everybody. And so teaching isn't something that you do for the people who will learn it spontaneously. It's something you do for the people who don't pick it up automatically. And so I tried to pick out an image for myself to be speaking to of a person who was, in my opinion, least likely to be able to function without a manual. The fact that she happens to be female is just an accident of the age. I'm sure there are lots of males who are in the same boat. So here are the three manuals. This first one is the one that says 800. It's brown on the cover. It's very distracting that the slide cuts out a little box every once in a while in the middle of it. This was the prototype manual that we did in 1978. I was hired in as a consultant, and it's interesting that the art department thought they were going to get to write the manuals. And when I was brought in, there was a certain amount of friction going on. I was in their territory. And I was brought in because there was nobody at Atari who would even talk to that dirty word, a user. And I had already run a public access computer center for 3 years. I knew lots of users. I had watched thousands of people encounter their first computer. And a friend of mine called me up and said, Liza, you got to come down here. We've got this machine designed, but nobody knows how to do an operator's manual. So I got the job. And I asked, how does this machine work? What's it supposed to do? And everybody said, well, we don't know. We just built a machine, so you write the operator's manual and we'll make it work that way. So it was quite a shock. I had never written a technical manual before, and I didn't want this to be technical, but I learned a huge amount. So that's the first one. That was 1978. The machine was announced at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, the Western Consumer Electronics Show in 1979. And we did another edition. There were 200 of these printed so that they could be given out at the Consumer Electronics Show. And they all went away. There was a version for the Atari 400 and the 800. I wanted to call them the Oz machines because I thought that you became a wizard when you learned to use one. And that's the American book, The Wizard of Oz reference. But the marketing department decided they would name them after the amount of memory they had for 800K and 400K bytes of memory. So you'll see, I'll talk about the design differences between the first and the second. And then the third one here is what actually shipped with the machine, and it's quite a bit different from my original conception. I don't know if anybody has copies of the first ones, the middle one here, or the brown one. I couldn't find any. I have copies. Okay, first example, design. The first fight that I had with the art department was over whether we had extraneous decoration in the manual. And you'll see across the top, the art department won that fight. All through the manual, there are pieces of print that have nothing to do with the message, which is exactly the opposite of message design. And you see this over and over. 50 years later, we have not learned this lesson. It's distracting. It adds to cognitive load. People wonder what it means, and I'm still against it. Lee talked about the community and the sort of communal construction of our knowledge base. And you'll see that this manual has 3 holes in it so that you put it in a 3-ring binder, and the original design, Atari also provided you with the binder. The message is, this isn't all there is, folks. You're going to have to add to this. So that's another aspect of design, the physical piece that carries the print is just as important as the print and what you put in it. Um, I also made this, every message in this manual is in at least 3 different media. It's in text, in narrative text. It's in pictures, which are realistic pictures. So my pointer isn't pointing as I'm moving my cursor, so I might as well stop doing that, is it? No, it doesn't show up on the screen. And it's in, down at the bottom, in diagrammatic or tabular form. Again, I'm trying to appeal to a really broad audience, and people have different learning styles, different channels that they're sensitive to. This has been forgotten in the design of an awful lot of what now passes for what we call e-learning and what I really call e-teaching. I think e-learning is a misnomer, and I'll say that 10 times more. Another thing I want to call your attention to on this slide is the Federal Communications Regulations notice on the bottom. You won't see that in most operators' manuals anymore because we've gotten over our concern and probably changed the design considerably. But when the Atari was first designed, everybody was worried that it would interfere with the television set. So these reassurances were important to include. So that manual got changed. Don't keep moving. 1, 2. That manual got changed as and reprinted, I think, before the Atari got shipped. I left Atari before the first one was shipped, and I never looked back. Went on to write many other manuals, and it's only in this last few months that I've gone and found what happened to the designs that I did. I knew that my designs didn't get followed through, but some aspects did. The pictures, and the pictures being realistic, did. The showing you the context of what the piece of equipment you're doing something with stayed. But they added the numbers, which are distracting, and they removed the immediate relationship between the narrative and the pictures. And they had 2 pictures for this. You'll also notice, if you look at number 6 here, the person that designed this wasn't using the design criteria that I was using. They didn't force themselves to provide the user with context. So in picture 6, you don't know where it is that hand is. You don't know where the switch that it's a picture of is. I think it's on the front of a television set, but in the interest of space, they took the context out of the picture. So it doesn't serve the purpose it was supposed to. They also took the picture with the person's hand over the mechanism. So you can't see how to really do this. These are all design features that the more we rely on mediated teaching, training, instruction, help, the more important these design features are. Here's another example of it. When we started talking, and in the operator's manual, because we didn't have a whole lot of software, this machine was shipped with a basic language cartridge, and in the operator's manual, we taught just a little bit of basic. So you get the message that you're going to have to program this machine to get what you want out of it. Again, the aspect of the message in different media, and specifically the arrows that connect the text with what you're supposed to pay attention to, and a principle of see this, do this, see the result. In the way the text flows, it's a single column. You don't have to know that the previous one, if you go back to the previous one, you have to know that there's 3 columns of text here. If you're not used to reading American English, and you might not get that. And you don't know what to read next. There's only one way to read this one. So these are just some of the design principles that went in. Here's what they did with the programming. And as you can see, they did take out the decoration. I was happy with that. But they took out the arrows. There's less white space. They went to a 3-column format. It's much harder to read. So that's a little bit about manual design. And I could, as I said, talk to each of these slides for at least an hour. And I give them to you so that you can go back to them and have fun with them. So from then to now, we've talked about hobby clubs, and we made the point that there was no documentation. We had to teach each other. And the spontaneous sort of precipitation of these clubs was key to teaching each other. It was very much what Howard is probably going to talk to us about of pedagogy. We taught each other. And one of the things that I'm really interested in today is this learning to code movement. And it's like, wait a minute, we taught each other to code. We didn't wait for somebody to teach us to code. So we went from hobby clubs to very simple, incomplete manuals, like the one I wrote, to a huge explosion of written instruction, which made, now I'm blanking on the name of the manual company, which is currently produces a huge number of manuals for everything from Ruby on Rails to how to use the internet. So we have a huge amount of written stuff, and then we got big enough computers so we could have help screens. And you all know about the Microsoft paperclip, which was sometimes helpful, but mostly annoying. And part of the reason, again, was because there wasn't much design science that went into the design of help screens. And now we've gone even farther down the sewer hole into what should be wonderful and sort of reproduce the hobby clubs in terms of many of the commercial documentation people are sending you on to crowdsourced user forums. There is more wrong information than there is right information on those. It's very difficult to get your questions answered. And we have a huge lack of authoritative documentation. By authoritative, I mean well-crafted and accurate. And of course, the see this, do this, get this result principle, it's very hard to continue that because the machines are changing so fast that by the time it's in print, the instructions you wrote are obsolete. So this is a problem we're going to have to deal with in the future. It's also a problem we're going to have to deal with online education, because the same thing is happening to our whole knowledge base. It's what's happening with digital and electronic devices is happening throughout our whole world. Knowledge is changing so fast that by the time we've tried to write a MOOC and deliver a MOOC about it, it's obsolete. I don't know how we're going to solve that problem, but I think we need to address it. Kind of to go back to the words that I put in the title. We talk about e-learning a lot, certainly in the States and in Britain, and I'm in the English-speaking community, but I'm sure it exists in the rest of the speaking world. And this is one of my very unhappy situations. I think it's the wrong word. E-learning is what machines do. What we're really talking about is e-teaching. And e-teaching is what happens when you write one act or one line of script for a 2-character play, and the other character is the learner. The other character isn't in the room with you. You have no control over them. And it's a whole different kind of teaching than what a classroom teacher does. Right now, we have classroom teachers trying to figure out how to go from the classroom to online using the techniques that they learned in classroom teaching, and it doesn't work. So I think we need to change the term from e-learning to e-teaching, because learning's the same whether your environment is a classroom or whether it's online or whether it's you sitting by yourself in a field trying to learn what bugs are in the grass underneath your feet, the learning process is the same. Synchronicity, since we've had writing and drawing and pictures on cave walls, we've had asynchronous development of materials for other people to learn from for teaching. But we've brought it to a whole new level with the communication that the computer is instrumental in making possible. We store messages and we forward them almost instantaneously, but we store them for a long time, so we now have this complete, a huge environment of message junk, which is wrong, obsolete, outdated, and wasn't well crafted to begin with. And we also have lost control in terms of when we go out of a classroom and have our audience away from us, and we lose a whole element of feedback, because if you craft a message, you send it to a student in a classroom and they say, I don't get it, you get another chance. But if you're trying to create a teaching tool that someone is going to access later and you're not going to be around, it's very important that it be of extremely high quality. And in addition to that, our learners have freedom to turn us off if we're working in a distributed environment. In a classroom, one of the techniques that teachers use is shaming the learner. We put the rank up on the wall and say, oh, you got an A and you got a D. But when you're dealing with free learners, if you shame them, they'll leave. So we need to develop whole new techniques to teach. You can see this in the use of error messages in the early computing. It's the programmer saying, oh, you made an error. Uh-oh, if the computer doesn't get it, the computer made an error. I, as the user, didn't. So we have a whole, Jerry's looking at me saying, hurry up. We have a whole need to rethink the way we craft these messages. I'm hurrying up. This is my penultimate slide. What I'm doing now is building a virtual museum, and I have several reasons for doing that. Virtual because I don't want to do the bother of actually building a brick and mortar institution, but also because I want it accessible throughout the world. We're focusing on the time period between 1960 to 1990. After 1990, a lot of what was done is already documented on the web, but there's a kind of dark spot in this really seminal period between 1960 and 1990. And I'm finding, like these manuals, in many cases, because I never threw anything away, I have the only copies of a lot of stuff. And a lot of the stuff that Jerry showed comes from my collection. I want to make this available to the world. It's a task which is much bigger than I am, so I won't get it done. And part of the reason why I want to speak and engage the rest of you is because we all need to do this together. This is not just my project. I see that I didn't get the URL on this slide, but I think it's on the next one after this one. The influencers are so important that I put the slide in again, because I really want you to look at these. There are links to hcle.org, which is the wiki for the virtual museum. The virtual museum doesn't exist yet. This is a communication platform for those of us who are building it, and a place where I call it it's the lounge for us all to sit together and talk, and the loading dock for us to put our ideas and our messages in. So there's you'll see that the pages on these 5 people are totally incomplete. If you can find more information on them, I invite you to follow the links that are there and put more information on. This is a community construction. So that's the messages that I have to offer. And I want to give Paula a chance to say something. And I really appreciate everyone who's out there listening and everyone who will be out there reviewing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liza. I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing any sort of large speech. I'm going to take a similar lead from Jeremy and perhaps ask a question that maybe at first it's more of a clarification question, Liza, but then also ends up being a little bit more of a larger epic question. So I'm a bit confused in general, and because the area of education and computing is not really my field, I think I would like it if you could clarify to the audience and to us, is your concern with education and computing about teaching people how the computer works, or teaching kids other subjects through computers, enhancing the pedagogical practice, or is it something different? I'm still not clear because, I mean, on the one hand, you say, why do we need coding academies, right? You ask that. You can teach yourself. And on the other hand, you have an example of the manual, which is also not at all a DIY approach. So what is the most important issue at stake here? And if you had to boil it down, what is it that you wanted to do in your life's work? And what do you think needs to be done still today? Now, larger question, but I still would love a bit more clarification.
I like the question, and I didn't give it to her. So if I get people to ask questions, I've accomplished my purpose. That's my purpose, to get people to ask questions. Let's see. It's both learning about computing and using the computer to be a vehicle for teaching, to teach other subjects, and using the computer as an environment for community, each one teaching each other. So there's all 3. As far as I'm concerned, we're all teaching all of the time, because every time one of us observes another doing something, we're learning something. So all 3. You can't force me to choose one. Or you can try, but you won't succeed. Specifically, I see in the ways that the hobby clubs came together and we taught each other how to compute, a model for learning all kinds of other things. So part of my objective is to encourage people to know about that model, to trust it. It worked then, it will work now, and it will work in the future. So I hope Howard will talk more. Howard has written a lot about this. We need to move from a kind of hierarchical system that says, here's the teacher, and the teacher delivers knowledge to the students or into the presence of the student and hopes that the learner absorbs what the teacher delivers, to a kind of a mesh or network model where everyone is always teaching just by being in interaction with other people. We need to be more aware of what we're teaching, whether we intend it or not, because learners are always learning no matter what we intend. And we also need to celebrate the fact that most people know something that someone else would like to learn. So even if it's a very small thing, we are all have the opportunity to be teachers, and we all have the opportunity to be learners.
Thank you very much, Liza. Can I just add something? So is that project of us all being teachers and learners, is that something that hasn't been fulfilled? I'm just playing devil's advocate here a little bit, but what about YouTube? What about the whole DIY culture? What about the maker culture? Is that something that you think as a legacy that's happening now, and I think it's doing quite well in terms of how we all learn from each other, and I don't know, go online and check out the newest thing to, I don't know, teach yourself about. So where's the work that's needed as teachers, as educators, as where is this gap? Because what I believe you and other people have started is going great. So is there anything still yet to do for other people, you know, in education? I'm just thinking, is there a gap? That's my question.
Isn't it exciting? It's going to happen no matter what I do. I'm really excited about that. Yeah, there are a couple of gaps. We, I don't know about the audience out there, but we here in the room and at this table in front of the room are all extremely well educated and have a very high perception of self-efficacy, to use Alfred Bandora's term. We know we can do it. People who become makers know they can do it. Inventors know they can do it. It's been going on throughout mankind. There have been innovators, DIY people. So this isn't new. But what we've also done simultaneously is exploit the sort of British public school model of how people are supposed to acquire wisdom, the old university model. We've exported it around the world, and I think we're in a kind of educational dark ages at this point. I talk to young people who say, "Oh, I hope they're going to run a coding academy in my town or in my school." And my question is, why wait? You don't need a coding academy. So they think there's a lot more work to do to make sure that the concept, the perception that you can be efficacious in designing your own learning, in choosing the pathway that you want to take. It used to be in medieval times that a group of students went out and hired a teacher. We could do that again, but it's not in the conventional wisdom. And with open educational resources movement, even the materials that you might need in order to do that are available. So yeah, it's really exciting.
Clemens, did you have a question?
If there's no question concerned to this, because now I think the discussion is going in a good direction, thinking about what the institution could be, but I guess that with Howard we come back to the point somehow. I had more, because it's an oral history workshop, I was wondering, and I have this anecdotal question more. So, I mean, the one thing is like, thanks for the US-American perspective here. I think we can blend it with the German perspective, even this is the first and the last time I think I will like take this perspective and point. But of course, like one of the superstars here, especially in Germany, would be still Friedrich Kittler as a computer scientist. And you know, he had this very provocative text where he said there is no software. And he doesn't mean only software as the software that we code, but also the computer manuals. And he even said something that the problem is that we're just building up a new tower of Babel in the end. As you said, it's really what you just explained. So there's a manual on the manual on the manual on the manual, and nobody understands it anymore. What's at the beginning somehow. But when you, and also with Lee's talk before, what I wondered so much was because you talked about the influences of this computer manual. Because in preparation for the workshop, I just reread Ted Nelson's Computer Lib and Dream Machines. And I'm wondering, is it just this like of red flag nobody wants to talk about still? Or is there something why this name doesn't come up somehow? Because I think that, I mean, it was written 74, right? The book, it came out. And as you also as you explained it, I mean, this is what he tried to do, right? The premise that everybody should understand computers, that it's just what he said, a versatile gizmo that you can turn to any kind of object, and then it's just a very like poetic idea to turn around computers. So I was wondering about where's Ted Nelson in the whole story?
I should have put Ted Nelson on that slide, but I met Ted Nelson later.
Yeah.
Before I started Loop Center, I started a bookstore, and both the Whole Earth Catalog and Computer Lib Dream Machines were bestsellers in my bookstore. Okay. So I was really heavily influenced, and then I had the privilege of meeting Ted about 15 years later, and then I met him again about 2 years ago. So he's still there and doing his rebel thing. But Ted and Ivan Illich, and you can't do in a presentation like this all the people who deserve the accolades and the acknowledgement. That's why the virtual museum is so important, because we can do it in that store and forward medium.
Yeah. Just like, was he ever part of the PCC? This is also something I never.
Ted Nelson?
Yeah.
He wasn't in the same town, I don't think.
Okay.
We have geographical stuff.
Okay.
Are there any more questions in the room? Marcel, and maybe Lee also wants to say something.
If I may, I should have mentioned Ted Nelson. And Ted started huge numbers of people in the direction of engagement with computers and through computers. And he definitely deserves as much honor and recognition as possible. The fact that he was motivated to create that compendium in almost a multimedia sense. It was all print, but he was attempting to apply the Whole Earth Catalog approach. He did that without being asked by anyone, and he did it in a very effective method, and he also combined it with a book really on computer graphics. He provided the basis for God knows how many people to plunge into computers really when there weren't necessarily computers available. So there should be an entire forum on it.
Marcel, how about you come up with your question now? I'm sorry, I didn't see you before.
Yeah, so my question is, did you notice some kind of development of, so what I'm interested in is the relation between the whole and the details. So in a way, when we see this, it says exploring designs for teaching about and through computers. And it seems to me that at that time, computer was kind of comprehensible as a system. So you could teach the system, and through that, you would probably teach people the corners of that, the tools in that sense. But then I think that through time, we got so much into the, like so many branches, abstractions, layers, and things like that. So we are at the moment in the later stage would be the app store, where you just go and the applications are actually like one single function, which in the 90s probably would be like half of the app store would be probably like few applications. So I'm just what I'm interested in, because you're observing that like decades of that. So do you see something like that? Do you see that's changing, or in which way you would approach it? I will just try to add my kind of observation. So there is a lot of demand to teach people in media theory what's the computer systems, and then most of the invitations are, oh, let's teach or let's learn programming. And I taught myself, I'm self-taught programmer, and it took me years. So if I kind of talk to my colleagues in media theory, and when they started programming, I'm usually like also hesitate to say why you would continue with that, because you need to invest years of that. But at the same time, I can't really recommend anything which is good system overview in that sense, which will, you know, so I'm interested if you noticed that before, and how do you see that whole kind of a period, yeah, in that particular perspective.
The immediate answer to your question is yes, I noticed it before, and that's a major reason why I went into this field. But before I go there, we talked about TED. Actually on the seminar now is Andy Van Dam, who is the person who first implemented hypertext. So send a message to Andy, and we should do a whole seminar with him as our guest. I just interviewed him, and it was marvelous. So thanks for being there, Andy. I hope you're still watching. So as far as systems approaches are concerned, my major motivation, I don't think everybody's going to be a computer programmer, and I'm the first one who is not going to be a computer programmer. I tried. There are lots of people who will be good computer programmers, and it won't matter how many years I put into it. I can't do the same thing twice. Anyway, we could do a whole session. I would love to do a whole session on the systems implications and the importance of systems thinking in our political and ecological life. One of the most exciting books that I have come across in the last couple of years is something called The Triple Focus, which I didn't put in here because it wasn't quite on target. It's a book by the guy that did Emotional Intelligence, Daniel Goleman, and the guy that does Organizational Systems Dynamics, Peter Senge. And it's their attempt to create a systems dynamics curriculum for young elementary school students. I think it's systems dynamics and emotional intelligence put together. I think it's the most important thing I've read in the last 3 years.
Can I just go directly to that, please?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Is yours directly to that? It isn't? I just wanted maybe, Liza, to rephrase Marcel's comment, because I think it's really, really important what you said, Marcel, and I'm just not sure if, I'm still not sure if we got an answer, Liza, so I'm going to prod you a little bit more for this, is that so you show this woman, really just to rephrase, you show this woman with a manual. I'm questioning who is that woman with the manuals today, and how do we bring computers to everyone if really the act of bringing and the computer means something completely different than what it was for you then and what it is for you now. Like, it's just the complexity of what the computer is so deep, so much more complex. And I think, just to rephrase that, it's just how do we even do that? That's, you touch the surface or you go deeper, or it's just so much more discouraging than homebrew sitting around tinkering. This is a different ball game we're playing here.
You're right. You have another 5,000 hours or so to address this question, because that's what I want to do with my next 5,000 hours.
Okay, so fair enough.
And there's a question from the chat from Oliver from Bremen, who wants to know from Liza what she thinks about the Wikipedia movement.
It's great. The more we can gather the knowledge of the world together and then redistribute it free, the better. And the fact that there's a big controversy about who are the editors of Wikipedia, and is it male dominated, and we proceed in baby steps. It's better that it's this way than that it didn't exist, and we'll make it better still. So I'm a great supporter, and not only that, I have, I think, 2 Wikipedia references on my slides. I use it a lot.
Let's take 1 or 2 more questions. I see Lily, and then we move on. And maybe also in the chat, of course, if anybody has something.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask you more about the hobby club model that you talked about. You described it as a model of teaching that maybe we could expand on and rely on more. So, in as much detail as you can remember, like, how are the hobby clubs organized? What kinds of kinks were worked out in the organization of the hobby club to kind of get it closer to what people wanted it to be, whatever that was? Yeah, and if you could organize a hobby club for learning today, what would you do to make that, like, what would you do with your lessons and wisdom since then to make that happen?
I think Howard's going to speak to that question, I hope. I did start the Sonoma County Computer Club, which didn't survive for very long. I wasn't involved in the organization of Homebrew. Part of the reason why I get labeled as so involved with homebrew is because one of the things I did was collect the newsletters and then republish them, which really doesn't have anything to do with that. But to answer respond to the issue of how does that serve as a model, right now our primary education model is classroom based.
Let me rephrase, because I think I understood what you were saying about the authority hierarchy versus the flat. It's just I don't have an experience of a hobby club. I've only learned in computer clubs in high schools and junior high schools. So like, where do you schedule it? How often do you schedule it? How is it funded? Did anyone cook? Who cleaned up? Stuff like that.
Okay, there's a platform called Meetup.
Uh-huh.
Go there. They're doing it. They're incorporating the computer platform with the face-to-face interaction, and that's a good place to start. Meetup.com.
Okay. I'm pretty sure that some people here in the room. You have a question?
No, I just wanted to comment something, but that's go ahead.
Okay. I'm pretty sure that people here in the room need a break. And I would then try to gather everybody and hang in there, even though we have gathered some delay. Gather everybody at 7:45. It's going to be worth it. I apologize to everybody that this is a serious delay, but Howard will join us any minute that he comes.